I want to just do a brief introduction before we get started and kind of set the tone. We are delighted that you could join us for the release of a new report that we have coming out today that is really a function of service. So over the last 6 months, as a senior research director, I have gathered a group of misfit toys and superheroes and distinguished former appointees to actually help us ask critical questions about how we secure the actual networks that each of us in our daily life relies on. Everyone in this room, everyone watching online, uses some public good, some federal service that actually requires the .gov. And I don't think we often really step back and think about how important it is to our life. So what we did, you start with why. Because it's so important, we actually kind of got together a group of Solarium alumni. So we were gracious enough, well, he was gracious enough, Corey Simpson, who's here from Grace-Based Strategies, was able to kind of put together a group of Solarium alumni. So that includes like Suzanne Spaulding here, me, who likes to work in the shadows, has the senior research director from Solarium, and a number of other task force members who you'll see in the second half. And actually, this was part of a larger network that Corey had been building at Grace-Based that involved a mix of private sector folks, including Booz Allen Hamilton, and a number of others that really got together in the best way possible to think about the future of cybersecurity. And so the conversation we'll have today is really the start, not the end. And so what we're going to do is take the first roughly 45 minutes. If it goes a little longer, that's fine. And we're going to start in the best American tradition with a fireside chat. So sitting before you, you have Suzanne Spaulding, who's our senior advisor for Homeland Security and the director for Defending the Democratic Institutions Project here at CSIS. As I mentioned, she was really a leading voice and a member on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And prior to that, served as the undersecretary at DHS. We're really, I mean, this is so interesting that we have so many people who shows the history of the emergence of CISA that live this, right? That your DNA and your experiences and your thoughts are just interwoven within it. So I couldn't think of a better person to have that historical and shared experience also with the other participant, Eric Goldstein. So Eric is the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. He leads CISA's mission to protect and strengthen the federal civilian agencies and nation's critical infrastructure against cyber threats. So if we literally had to pick one person from DHS that we would want to come talk about this report, that's the guy. Now, in addition to that, again, a theme you'll see cutting across this is this not just protecting public goods in cyberspace from a public, but how it intersects the private sector. He also has experience at Goldman Sachs. The other experience closest to my heart is he actually was a fellow at CSIS where he worked on the adversary attacks on democracy with Suzanne Spaulding. So there's a lot of history amongst the participants today, but all of them share, like I mentioned at the beginning, that deep commitment to service and how we actually think about securing our federal networks. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to both of you.
Great. Thank you, Ben, and thank you for leading this terrific effort, and to the entire research team and to the task force for what I think was a great report, and to our funders and our supporters. Eric and I also had the great pleasure of working with Eric back when I was undersecretary. And Eric, I don't remember your title. I just remember you were the guy I had sitting at my right at all times.
I think the title, just
yeah,
guy on the right.
The guy on the right that you gave all the important stuff to. So it's just was such a joy to me to see you take over this position and leading the cyber efforts. And you were there, of course, and saw as the team at what was then called National Protection Programs Directorate, a team from folks across that organization locked themselves in a windowless room for week after week after week to develop the plan to transition from NPPD to the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. And one of the reasons that we thought that was so important was that there was not a good understanding out there of the role that DHS played in cybersecurity. And I think that understanding is much greater today. But Ben alluded to this, and we'll get into it a little bit in the report. Not only does the public not really understand CISA's role with regard to .gov, as opposed to the broader critical infrastructure, but neither does some of the .gov agencies. So I thought we'd start by having you articulate CISA's role for the security and resilience of federal civilian executive branch agencies.
Absolutely. Let me just start with just a few thank yous. The first is to CSIS and the task force for taking on this effort. When Suzanne's team reached out some number of months ago and said CSIS is kicking off the task force on CISA's role in federal cybersecurity, I said, this is awesome. And it's awesome for two reasons. It is awesome in a general standpoint because, in fact, the preponderance of CISA's cybersecurity resources, budget, personnel, authorities are actually focused on our federal civilian.gov mission. So this is an area where we have grown significantly, both in our authorities and our capacity, and where this kind of study really adds tremendous value in helping us, helping the community, helping Congress think through how we mature. It's also an area of real personal passion of mine. My first role at CISA's precursor agency, even before I had the privilege of working for Suzanne, was in our federal cybersecurity arm. Even before I began working at CISA or at MPPD, I worked for an FFRDC, where I supported the then Deputy Secretary Jane Hall-Lute in thinking through this future program called Einstein. And so, I have been deeply enmeshed in this space for well over a decade, and just so excited that CSIS took on this effort and for the progress that I know will come from it. I'll also offer my personal thanks for two people here, Suzanne Spaulding and Dr. Phyllis Schneck, without whom, first of all, CISA would not exist as an agency, and I cannot overstate the criticality of that transition from MPPD to CISA in enabling us to effectuate our both federal and national risk reduction mission, and also helping CISA become a mature, modern, scalable agency that enables us to have the kind of impact that we'll talk through today. So Suzanne and Phyllis, thank you for the foundation you laid that all of us are just putting shingles and paint on the walls around. So this is a great starting point to think through what is it that we do in federal cybersecurity. And the top line bullet is, well, we're the operational lead for federal civilian cybersecurity. But what does that mean? We serve three key foundational roles. The first is we set a common baseline across 102 federal civilian agencies. We do that by issuing directives that require agencies to do things like manage vulnerabilities, understand their assets, hunt for vulnerabilities in a common way, and we provide a common technology baseline. So every agency, we'll talk a lot about this, is part of our continuous diagnostics and mitigation program, which means they all have common tools, common reporting around things like understanding their assets, their vulnerabilities, their configurations. And so managing 102 agencies around a common baseline and set of requirements. The second is working to actively connect dots around risks that are affecting the federal civilian executive branch. And so even though each agency is still accountable for, in the first instance, identifying risks affecting their network, each agency is only seeing what's happening within their enterprise. And it's our job to come over the top and say, well, if we see a campaign that's targeting the State Department, is it also targeting Commerce and the Marine Mammal Commission and the Small Business Administration? And if so, what do we do about it? And so providing that umbrella of detection and protection to detect emerging risks and acting accordingly. And the third critical area is to fill gaps. There's extraordinary heterogeneity across federal civilian executive branch agencies. You have agencies like the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice that have very mature cybersecurity programs, very well resourced, they have fully functioning 24/7 security operations centers. There's a lot that don't. And so if you think across those 102 agencies, there's a lot of agencies that frankly are roughly equivalent to small and medium businesses in their IT infrastructure, their IT management, their security practices. And so just as we don't expect small and medium businesses to manage cybersecurity on their own, similarly, we shouldn't expect that of small agencies either. And that's where CISA comes in to provide shared services, provide on-site support, and that's an area of real growth for us to say, let's help raise that bar for agencies across government so that the more mature ones, we can just help ensure that they meet that baseline, but the ones that are less mature will provide tailored, targeted support so they have to do less and we'll see better outcomes.
Great. So in that context, you said at one point in that terrific description of the mission space, even though each agency is ultimately responsible for their own, protecting their own networks, security and resilience. But that has always been, I think, a bit of an issue, right? The line between what CISA can and should do and be held accountable for, what it is responsible for with regard to the federal civilian executive branch agencies, and what the agencies must still ultimately be accountable for. And I've always thought it was important that the cabinet secretaries, the heads of those agencies and departments, ultimately are held accountable there. So how do you guys think about where you draw that line, doing everything you can to help, but making sure accountability falls where it should?
Absolutely. We think that the key differentiating question is between what agencies should do and how agencies should do it. And so we think that CISA's role is first and foremost to establish what agencies should do, consistent with OMB cybersecurity policies and associated guidance, making sure that every single agency understands whether you are managing your assets, managing your vulnerabilities, hunting for threats, dealing with end-of-life risks. Every agency should be held accountable to a common set of requirements, and that is CISA's, in the first instance, to promulgate, for example, through our binding operational directives. But then the question is, okay, well then how do agencies meet those requirements? And it might be the case that the more mature agencies are able to do more themselves, as long as they are able to demonstrate, ideally using automated means, that they are meeting the requirements, as long as they are reporting back to CISA the right level of data, that's terrific. But there are a lot of agencies that can't and probably shouldn't. And so for those agencies, then the question is, if an agency is reasonably unable to meet those requirements, or if it's the case that it is an imprudent use of taxpayer dollars to be separately funding common capabilities across agencies, that's where CISA can come in and gap fill. There's a few different variations of this theme. A great example is our vulnerability disclosure platform, where we issued a directive a few years ago that says, every single federal agency needs to have a vulnerability disclosure program that enables security researchers to identify and report vulnerabilities in federal websites and web applications, just like every single mature company has. But we said, now agencies, you have to meet that requirement. If you, for some reason, already have a bug bounty program, if you're already working with a reputable bug bounty vendor, that's great. Keep that up, make sure it meets the requirements, make sure we're seeing the vulnerabilities that come in. But also, we're going to stand up a centralized bug bounty program for the whole government that's going to be centrally managed, centrally funded, cheaper, more effective. So if agencies aren't doing their own, or they want to use one that's already being managed for them, come on over. And we've seen great uptake of that program. We've seen over 1,500 vulnerabilities in federal websites and web apps identified and closed in the last year alone. And that's an example of saying, here's the requirement, we're going to make it easier for you to manage it through a shared service, and let's then raise the bar across government.
So that sounds great. But one of the concerns that came out from as the research team did their interviews across government is CISA is taking on more and more in this context, and do you really have the capability to do those things? Because again, I think hand in hand with this has to come an assignment of accountability. And if CISA is saying we are going to be this provider, you will be held accountable and should be held accountable for doing that. And do you have the capabilities in terms of resources, in terms of personnel, in terms of strategy and analysis? And
we are making real progress. I would say Congress has been extraordinarily helpful over multiple administrations in a bipartisan manner to provide both the resources and the authorities that we need to drive meaningful progress in this direction. A few examples. 3 years ago or so, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan Act, which for the first time provided us with significant funding to deploy endpoint detection and response tools across federal agencies, gave us resources to stand up what we call our federal enterprise improvement teams, which are CISA humans who deploy to agencies to work directly with the CISO and his or her staff to help drive long-term improvements. And so that's given us, I think, the foothold to have the kind of visibility that we need at different layers of the federal environment and have those people who are deployed to agencies to understand those unique risks and drive progress. It's notable that in two separate NDAAs, Congress gave us some really unique authorities, including the ability to do threat hunting and vulnerability testing without prior authorization, which is a total game changer for us. Because what that means, as one example from the headlines, folks who work in cybersecurity probably know that we are managing right now a pretty notable vulnerability in Cisco devices. We were able to see, using CDM, which agencies are running these devices. We are then able to do our no-notice vulnerability testing to actually try to exploit agency devices and see if they are actually running a vulnerable version, and if so, what we can actually accomplish by exploiting that vulnerability. And then obviously we do that with the agencies, and so if we find something, we tell them immediately so they can fix it, but that gives us the ability to move with a level of proactive agility that was infeasible even a year or two ago. So the answer is, we have significant resources, we have significant authorities, but we have been on a very positive trend line where we have not yet reached the end state. And one critical question for us is going to be, can we continue on this trajectory, and can we continue shifting that balance of visibility, of agility, towards giving CISA the ability to help agencies understand their own risk? That's going to require ongoing, sustained investment over multiple future fiscal years for us to actually make sure that we can accomplish our goals.
Yeah, and that ability to do that threat hunting without getting that long, tortured negotiation with the General Counsel's office at whatever federal department or agency is, as you say, it's really a game changer. It's huge, and CISA has benefited from bipartisan support over many years for legislation to advance your authorities, to clarify and codify existing authorities, and to support your budget needs and give a sense of stability with respect to that budget. Unfortunately, we're at the moment seeing that forward progress threatened, as we have a member of the Senate, Senator Rand Paul, who is holding up legislation that is being reported out of the Homeland Security Committee on a vote of 10-1, 10 in favor, but it's not getting floor votes. And also members who are threatening to slash CISA's budget over an issue that they think is important. Can you talk to us a little bit about what impact that would have, both on CISA's abilities, but also on the ability of departments and agencies to plan? Because that out-year planning is one of the important issues the report raises.
Yep. The starting point needs to be that our nation and our federal government is facing truly acute cyber threats. We only need to look at the DNI's annual threat assessment to note the extraordinary resources, investment, intent from adversaries like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and adjacent criminal groups. And in that context, it couldn't be more critical that CISA is able to continue investing in modern, scalable solutions, that we're able to continue building out our authorities to enable agencies to manage their risks in the right way. We remain optimistic that cybersecurity remains a bipartisan topic. We have a hearing this week with our House Homeland Subcommittee with Chairman Garbarino, who has been a wonderful supporter and advocate. And so, we are optimistic that the more that we can articulate both the extraordinary threat that we are facing from advanced malicious cyber actors and the need that our progress here is fragile and needs to be sustained by continued bipartisan support and funding, we will enable further advancement in the years to come.
Yeah. So we do have some questions from our audience, and the first couple go to the threats from our foreign adversaries and the very much heightened tensions that we are facing today, specifically about technologies and efforts to identify and prevent countries like Russia from conducting cyber operations, such as spreading false information to influence the United States. So CISA's role in understanding and countering information operations is I know a sensitive one and a tricky one, but a question about that. And then ahead of next year's election, the role that CISA can play in helping to defend our democracy against these kinds of threats.
In the second part of that question, our role has been and continues to be supporting the state and local election officials who are on the front lines of our democracy in the context of cybersecurity, ensuring that they have the tools, the information, the services, the guidance they need to protect our election infrastructure against all manner of threats. It is the case that state and local officials are often the best, most effective voice to provide the right, accurate information for their constituents, and our goal is to enable and empower our state and local partners to be that voice for their communities to ensure that the right information gets out. It is certainly the case that we are seeing malicious cyber actors, whether Russian or otherwise, execute hybrid types of operations where malicious cyber activities are combined. For example, with disinformation, certainly we are focused, in the federal context on the cyber aspect of those campaigns and making sure that we can prevent, detect, and respond rapidly to intrusions as they occur. But certainly the threat environment is evolving rapidly, and we do see our adversaries invest both in cyber operations and those adjacent to it.
Yeah, I still have the scars from having been the undersecretary in 2016 and the Russian activity around that election, and how slow we were to recognize the scale and scope of the information operations that were the true threat to the public's acceptance of the legitimacy of that election. And we were very focused on protecting the networks and the traditional cybersecurity threat. And I'm very hopeful that we've learned our lesson and we won't repeat the mistakes of the past, and that Congress will let CISA do its important mission on that front. We've also got a question. So you touched on the adjacent to federal, civilian, executive branch agencies is state and local governments, and certainly a lot of attention on election officials. But there's a question about whether you envision a future where all state and local agencies can transition to a .gov domain. Is that something we ought to be thinking about? Does that make sense?
Every state and local government should be on the .gov domain hard stop. We have, for those tracking at home, CISA manages the .gov top-level domain. We have an awesome team that both, I will say, markets the importance of the .gov domain, and it is not just a question of helping Americans understand the legitimacy of the state and local web domains that they are using. Moving to .gov has significant security benefits too, and so being a managed domain, we provide significant security features that help, for example, reduce the risk of website defacement, hijacking, and the like. And so, we have made real progress. We have had hundreds of state and local organizations move over to .gov in the past year alone, but this is an area of urgent priority for us. And so, absolutely, every state and local entity should have a plan to move to .gov in the near term.
Yeah. So our focus, of course, in this report was on that cyber piece of CISA's mission. But as a lot of people don't realize, CISA continues to have, in addition to the cyber mission, it has the all hazards security and resilience of critical infrastructure mission. And that means terrorism, sabotage, natural disasters, as well as cyber, right across the board. And as you know, I always felt passionately that that grouping made sense because we have to manage the risks to critical infrastructure. We need to look at that as a business risk, as a continuity risk, whatever the source of that disruption might be. But it's also important that those lessons be carried over and so can you tell us a little bit about the degree to which the cyber folks are benefiting from the resilience lessons, for example, that the folks were looking at the physical aspects of critical infrastructure are gaining, and vice versa? Absolutely. Is there still a benefit in your mind to keeping those together?
Yeah, we very much see cybersecurity as not being an end in itself, but being a means to enable the resilience and continuity of critical functions under all conditions. And so the starting point needs to be what in fact are the critical functions and services that we as Americans care about, what are the ways in which those functions and services could be disrupted, and then how do we maximize our security and resilience against those threats and risks. And so I think we can learn a lot from the heroism of our colleagues in Ukraine, where we saw that although they were facing significant malicious cyber activity, they were of course seeing vastly more significant kinetic attacks, and what was actually most effective in Ukraine was not cyber defenses standing alone, but actually both functional and societal resilience. And so we are really focused on ensuring that, first of all, we know that we are not going to prevent, as a country, as a community, as any given organization, every cyber intrusion. So our goal needs to be, how do we minimize the impact of intrusions that do occur such that the American people are able to access the data, the services, the functions upon which we all depend. And that requires some really multidisciplinary work around both the owners and operators of critical systems to think through what is actually critical here and how could it be accessed, and then individuals and teams who focus on resilience, whether that is in the physical context or the all hazards context. We're actually doing a lot of work now with FEMA to learn from their understanding of how we maximize resilience around natural hazards. How are those principles extensible both to the cybersecurity and human-made impacts as well? And so the answer is this has to be synergistic, because the end we seek can't just be a perfectly secure system that we know is a fool's errand, but a system that is functionally resilient under all conditions.
Yeah, and resilient in terms of being able to continue to enable the functions.
That's right.
Which is what we really care about at the end of the day, right? Not the computers. And similarly, I think there is, the task force spent a fair amount of time looking at the linkages between the work that CISA does for the private sector and the work that CISA does for the federal civilian executive branch agencies, and a real interest in making sure there too that there is complete permeability, if you will, between, in terms of the insights and knowledge and data that's coming in. And one of the recommendations from the solarium that we foot stomped is the creation of the joint collaborative environment, and making sure that with this mandatory reporting, for example, on both the federal side and the non-government side, that you have the resources and the wherewithal to take that data in and make sense of it and provide insights back and across government and private sector. Is that happening, and how's that working?
Absolutely. One of the biggest changes within CISA from when we were there 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago is CISA used to have very limited access to really good cyber data. We had a little bit, but it was very limited. That has changed dramatically in the past really 2 or 3 years, right? Where we now have access to, for example, attack surface management data, endpoint detection and response data, protective DNS data, data on every single asset across the federal government, across over 100 agencies, millions of assets. That is extraordinarily powerful information, but today we still manage that in a overly high friction, overly siloed way. And so that's why I think a topic that we might get to in a minute is our efforts to build what we call CADS, which is the Cyber Analytics Data System, which is the internal infrastructure within CISA to say, holy cow, we actually have really good data now. Let's use it for something. And to give our analysts that infrastructure to be able to say, how can we correlate this data across different data sets, different elements, different workflows, and understand emergent risks that frankly would otherwise be lost. And CADS is the internal CISA system to do that work. So our analysts, our operators have the modern scalable infrastructure, benefiting, I have to say, AI at least once per Fireside Chat, benefiting the latest in AI and ML systems, so we can actually use that data to derive meaning and drive risks. That's only the first step, because we also know that we don't have a monopoly on valuable cybersecurity data. And so what we are driving towards with the joint collaborative environment is to say, how can we then level up what we're building with CADS to create an environment where our partners can either benefit from the data we have, can bring their own data, can query our data against what they're seeing, and really create collectively a place where cyber analysts across trusted partners can work across common data sets to identify previously unseen risks. And you mentioned our pending cyber incident reporting requirements. Our hope is when this rulemaking goes into effect, it is going to be the world's best, most impactful repository of cyber risk information. And so by the time that mandatory reporting starts coming in, we've got to have the ability to analyze it against everything else we are seeing and then make it available in an appropriately anonymized, aggregated, privacy protective way so that the community can benefit from that visibility as well. And so, frankly, among so many areas, this is one where the Solarium really was prescient in helping us think through how do we invest now in an environment that we know will be needed in the years to come.
Yeah, excellent. That's great. So one final question from our audience with regard to binding operational directives. I don't know whether you'll be able to share with us, but wondering what you're thinking about for 2024. What's sort of next potentially on the agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I'll just open by saying on that, it is a different day for CISA binding operational directives than it has been in years past. And that is due to a through line through this conversation, which is our access to real, meaningful data. And so, I really can't overstate for this audience the fact that our CDM program, when it was originally instantiated over a decade ago, was largely a way to give agencies cybersecurity tools with integration support at bulk discounts, which is great, right? Everyone wants new tools. It has become the US government's default model for identifying real-time cybersecurity risks across every single federal agency. And so today, when we have a question about where is this new vulnerability, are we seeing this threat signature anywhere across government, we open up the CDM federal dashboard and we can see that data at our fingertips, which then changes the way in which we think about binding operational directives, because it is no longer the case, as it was a few years ago, that we are getting spreadsheets back from federal agencies saying, here's how we're doing, and we're saying, okay, well, we have some questions on your spreadsheet. Increasingly, we are able to use the CDM system to actually just be able to see, hey, how are you doing? And I will offer, we issued a directive, our most recent directive, Directive 2302, was focused on remediating network management interfaces, which came in really handy with the Cisco vulnerability that I mentioned that is affecting web interfaces, where we could say, oh, we actually know who is running exposed web interfaces. We know who's already deprecated their Cisco iOS XE web interfaces, and we can do all that work ourselves in real time. And so, the way that we think about directives generally is based on three variables. A, do we have data to support measurement of the directives? Second, is it something that we think is responsive to an urgent risk facing federal agencies as required in the underlying statute? And third, is it actually achievable by federal agencies? And so there's a lot that we would like agencies to do, but if they are not budgeted to do that work in the near term, we can direct all we want, and they might want to do it, but they are not going to be able to. And so, as we think through the next round of directives, working with our partners at OMB, I think we will be looking at aspects of the federal technology environment where we think more focus, more prioritization might be needed, and where we have data to support our measurement of progress.
I think that's so smart. I mean, it's really important to maintaining the credibility of the binding operational directive, that whole system, that you have an ability to really enforce the directives you put out there with the help and the backing of OMB, so that it is taken seriously, and making sure that you are being realistic in what you're demanding of the agencies is a critical part of that. So that's terrific. So I know you've got a hard stop, but if there's anything more you want to say on CADS, I think why moving from Einstein 3A to CADS, and particularly the role of classified information, would be great.
Yep. Absolutely. There are two intersecting variables that led us to the transition from the legacy Einstein or National Cybersecurity Protection System program to CADs. The first is just a dramatic change both in the threat environment, but also in the cybersecurity market, where when we thought of Einstein 3A, which is an approach to these classified indicators to detect and block traffic at the ISP level. First of all, the commercial cybersecurity market and the availability of really effective, timely cyber threat information was much more limited, and the availability of equivalent shared services, things like protective DNS resolution, was much more limited. And so the environment's really changed. And as we looked at the E3A program over the past couple of years, we said, frankly, this is a very expensive program. The residual benefit of using high-side indicators for inline intrusion protection was very limited, and there are really good services for things like protective email, email filtering, DNS syncing, that we can offer much more affordably, much more scalably, with actually much better features. And so we said, okay, so let's think through how to modernize that program, first shifting protective DNS to a commercial shared service, and then thinking about the future of email filtering, and let's take the savings from that transition and let's shift the program into focusing on this analytic infrastructure that we need for all the reasons that we discussed. And so really, this is a reflection of our ability and I think increased willingness to say, the ideas of a decade ago in cybersecurity probably don't make much more sense. Let's leverage what the commercial market has to offer. Let's focus on declassifying information instead of keeping everything in extremely expensive classified channels. And then let's focus on making best use of the data we have to derive unique learnings that only we can develop.
Excellent. And I'm particularly pleased that piece of let's focus on declassifying rather than building an incredibly cumbersome and expensive structure to protect what we think is classified and that we think we're going to keep secret from our adversaries who already probably have that information.
Indeed.
Right. So glad to see that. I think that's terrific. Well, Eric, it is just so inspiring and such a joy to me to hear how far you guys have come. I feel like it was the Ice Ages, Phyllis, when you and I were there now, when I hear about all of the amazing things that you're doing. And I hope that Congress will get its act together to continue to support you on the bipartisan basis that it has in the past, and wish you all the best. And thank you so much for taking time today to be with us.
Thank you all for the work and looking forward to our shared efforts going forward.
All right, we're going to reconvene here. Hopefully that was microphoned and you could hear all sorts of things we just talked about, including how well we can read our children's facial expressions. So more importantly, what we're going to do now for the remainder of the session is really transition to talk about the report. So what we've done is gather some of the task force members and brought them on stage. So I'm going to go from my right to left and just give some quick introductions. So we'll start with CSIS's own Deputy Director at the International Security Program, Emily Harding. She also, as of tomorrow, it'll be announced that her new initiative on intelligence, national security, and technology will begin. So really great to have her insights as part of this. Second, we have Malcolm Harkins. Malcolm used to be the CISO at Intel, but is honestly such a dynamic person. He quickly moves around to new wicked problems to solve, most recently joining a new startup called Hidden Layer. Now, to my immediate left, we have another Solarium alumni, David Simon, who is the global co-head of cybersecurity and data privacy at Skadden and ARPS. And then last but not least, at the far end of the task force panel here, we have Phyllis Schnick. She's a vice president and the CISO for Northrop Grumman. And also, as you heard, it wasn't the Ice Age, but may have some bureaucratic scars from kind of doing all the great work in PPD and later to kind of launch what you just heard from CISA. So thank you all for joining me. I really want to just start off with a very simple question. And I'll open it up. We'll start with kind of Malcolm. What was the most salient insight from the report? As we kind of had all these meetings and it kind of condensed into the report, what really jumped out at you?
Well, I think there was a couple things that really stood out. One, the tabletop exercises that were conducted, I think were immensely useful, and I think the public survey that was done was telling. And I think the data in there is interesting, and specifically that I think, almost everybody who participated in the tabletop or the public surveys was that, threat actors would by and large go after basic needs and disruption as a means of affecting the US government, directly and indirectly.
Yeah.
And for me, that was probably one of the most insightful and I'd say unusual. I wasn't anticipating that when we were starting the tabletops.
So just to clarify for the folks online in the audience, one of the things we did that was unique about this report is, in addition to your usual research, what's the current state of play, we took a historical eye, which how did the current state of being come to be, and then to anticipate the future, what we did is conduct a tabletop exercise where we basically let first 60 experts, either in the public or private sector, simulate being a baddie, being the bad guy, right? And they could pick their bad guy of choice. Here's to you, Xi Jinping, you were the most popular bad guy. And they could seek to then try to target the FCEB, right, the Federal Civilian Agency Networks. And what Malcolm is saying is really disconcerting is most people chose to target basic services. So just to put that in layman's terms, I want you to imagine you wake up tomorrow and over 44 million Americans are missing a meal because SNAP goes down. And if you imagine that in a certain point in a political timeline, say an election or a key announcement, just the insane amount of upheaval that could cause, and then even just some of the way it would be amplified by disinformation. So that's really what he's referring to. And then we also had 1,000 people online. So think of a representative sample of the American population do it. And it wasn't just the experts. Private citizens did the same thing. So sometimes when experts and the general public show you what they think the threat is, you should pay attention. So I was captured by that too. Emily, quiet moderator put back in. How about for you? What was the most kind of salient insight that jumped out over this process?
Well, I also enjoyed the tabletop exercises, in no small part because you allowed my children to participate.
I did.
And you can see how evil teenagers can be when they really unleash their minds on the cyber world. But one thing that I wanted to touch on was something that Eric mentioned in his fireside chat with Suzanne, and that was this idea of CISA as a partner to the federal enterprise. It hasn't always been like that. I think that too often, so much of the federal enterprise has seen CISA as like, oh, it's mom and dad coming to tattle on me and get me in trouble, and it's become more and more of a real partnership over time, and that's really due to the hard work and the patience of leaders in the organization, like Phyllis, like Suzanne, who did a whole bunch of hard work at the time to build those relationships. But then the report also points out that there are some growing pains there, that CISA is attempting to scale up to answer this huge need and provide the services that need to be provided. And then at the same time, parts of the federal enterprise are trying to scale up to absorb those services. And both of those require money. They require talent that's in very short supply. But it also requires some cultural shifts on both sides. And trying to grow together is one of the challenges I think the federal government is really facing.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about how resources aren't enough. It's how do you kind of square that classic bureaucratic challenge of coordination, which I think is optimistic, but I hope that optimism is well placed.
Yep.
How about Phyllis, turning to you, the most salient insight from this whole process?
I think, and first of all, thank you very much to CSIS and for the opportunity to be here. And we should call out Eric Goldstein and Director Easterly for the great work that they've been doing to take this forward. I think on the insight point, there are two. One is elevating cybersecurity to be risk. In every agency and across the federal government, this is about risk. And I think the second is the answer is not just about money. And the report calls that out, up front. And if I were to look at another key thing we have to think about is how it all comes together. We've talked a lot about this CAD, so I'm going to call it a common operating picture. Way back in the day, we called it the cyber weather map because it was our analogy to how data comes in. But this is a moment. This is a moment in the federal government where we have the opportunity with the new regulations coming in to have reporting coming into CISA with the leadership and talent, to Emily's point, that's in CISA, even though it is, we want more talent, to have that data from people and machines come together. And what CDM will do for you is, it did start as a bunch of tools that were given to every agency, but in perspective, what it gives you is data that's happening at each agency that we wouldn't see without it. Before all of this, the adversary knew the networks better than we did. now that these things are carried forward, you have data points that come from each agency that come into a central place, and you couple that with the legacy and then the follow-on to Einstein, the measuring of what's happening at the perimeter. This is the moment when CISA can put this together and really drive it. And I think what the report does is says, how are we going to seize this moment?
It's great. I mean, common operating pictures are, central to the military profession. It's shocking to look back and realize how vulnerable we were because of blindness.
Yeah.
All right, David Simon, you've been in this space a long time, so you've dealt with these reports. How about this one?
Well, look, so much has already been said, and of course I want to begin with my thanks to the whole team and to CSIS and to the great work that Jen and the whole team at CISA have been doing. I would just say, look, we all recognize that CISA is at an inflection point. There are big questions around how the mission can be fulfilled, not just for the FCEB, but also for the companies and the private sector that really own and operate a lot of the infrastructure that is, the same sort of ecosystem. And as a lawyer in private practice and a former government, lawyer, I see this every day because I'm an incident responder. And so I think one thing that is especially important at this moment, which the report underscores, is that at a time when CISA is going to move from not only getting more data and having more authorities, it's also getting the regulatory authority. And that changes the picture, what it means to be a partner with CISA for federal agencies and also for the private sector. And so I think it's really important that that value is seen, sharing the information that is obtained, because if you are experiencing a burden, whether a federal agency or a private business, because of the new reporting requirements and other regulations, it doesn't feel as bad if you're getting something in return, if you're getting the insights from the government. And I think the other thing is to be able to do a better job of promoting the sort of common frameworks and standards so that when coordination happens, it needs to happen more, we all know what we're asking for. We know what our roles are. And I think that's something that's hard to see from where I sit outside. And in the task force report, I think it was very clear that it's not all about more money. It's about having a common language and making sure folks know what they're getting in return.
Yeah. Just to follow up with you on that for a second, David, what would you then consider the top recommendation from the report?
My personal take is that it's the recommendations on metrics, so 2.5. So one of the things that is commonly misunderstood is that CISA is doing so much with so little, and often there's this gap. Every agency, but also CISOs, CTOs in the private sector have this issue of ultimate accountability when something goes wrong, but no authority to do anything about it. And so when you go and ask for more resources or more support or more empowerment, then the question is, okay, how did it go? And so it's very important to be able to have metrics that enable you to tell the story, to quantify it. And so the report does underscore the need for not just threat-based, process-based metrics, but also really gestures towards control-based metrics. So if you're a CISO, and obviously we have a distinguished CISO to my left and former CISO to my right, and many folks in the room and online, it's being able to explain why, changing from this on and off switch in this direction dramatically changes the story. And I can tell you, as I walk into a breach, clients that don't have multi-factor authentication, forget zero trust. Most companies don't have that. They don't have multi-factor authentication, consistent controls, defense, and depth. They're a sitting duck. And so for CISA to be able to measure that and be able to emphasize the importance of that will make it much easier to explain why it needs more resources and why it should have the authority and funding support, its mission set.
Malcolm, if I could just get you to pick that up, because we talked a lot about risk. And in fact, frankly, for everyone, Malcolm and I had many nerd sessions talking about risk well beyond the report. But picking up this idea that being able to actually see where your vulnerabilities are, see who's in your network or trying to get in your network, but then codify that with data as risk. How does that drive planning?
Well, I think, there's two things we have to think about. There's measures of motion, and there's measures of progress. And we need to understand which measures we have that are, meeting things that are just, saying we're doing a good job versus really having a design goal. What am I trying to achieve? How am I trying to be resistant to and resilient from a cyber attack to something that's going to be materially impacting to a business process, to a service, to the nation? Lining that up and then having the metrics around that is incredibly important. And then, and David mentioned this, the metrics and the coordination, even from an incident response, including proactively, we have to have a unity of effort and a unity of command so that we have the accountabilities and responsibilities, not only as CISOs, as CIOs, CTOs, in the agencies, but also in CISA. So that way you don't end up fractured between them, because that fracturing will create the gap that will allow the adversaries to exploit us and turn a vulnerability into an exploitable exposure that causes that impact that we're trying to prevent.
So much here is about planning. You know, it's hard for me not to think about this as a military officer, about planning and how do you align resources against risk, looking forward, not just in the moment. And turning to you, Emily, what would you say is the recommendation that jumped out the most?
Well, every recommendation is fabulous. All of them should be implemented as of tomorrow. But as far as the ones that I thought were the most important, multi-year funding for a lot of these initiatives is really important. I come from a background on the Hill, so I say this as a former authorizer, not appropriator. They're a whole different breed, but authorizer. That seeing agencies struggle with funding cycles that are both long-term and unpredictable is truly difficult. They have hard choices to make, and planning is hard, and all of it's hard. Giving them the opportunity to use those funds over multiple years or to stick something in the bank for a rainy day, like, as much as it pains anyone who has served in Congress to hand some of that control back to agencies, we really need to do it. So that's a big one. Suzanne's point, too, about leadership and accountability, I think, is absolutely critical. Too much in this field in particular, because it has a technical aspect to it, you see people saying, oh, well, that's the cyber guys. Like, that's the CISO's job. That's them. That's not me. And being the storyteller that says, okay, sure, this is my area of responsibility to manage as the CISO, but let me talk about how it's going to affect you and your legacy as the head of this agency or department, how it's going to affect the security of the entire federal government. Telling that story is so important. So finding ways to increase that accountability so these great leaders who are trying to accomplish great things also understand that this is part of their core job description.
I mean, this goes back to the common operating picture, right? Because it's not just the snapshot of now, but if you do the statistics in the past, you can begin to at least partially quantify that risk, which helps that conversation. Hey, every CISA who's been where you are right now who didn't respond, here are the additional attack surfaces that emerged, here's how they move laterally in your network, and here's the consequences. And your point about funding, I mean, you've done other work on this too, but even when you tell someone, we'll give you a CDM capability for 2 years, the smart programmer is already thinking a palm ahead of like, well, how do I fund this 2 years out?
Yep.
And then how do I justify that to the agency head when no matter how much money there is, no one ever has infinite money, right? So how are you actually facilitating those internal conversations across agencies so that they can bring risk into the discussion and do it? I mean, turning to you, Phyllis, what were some of the insights and the recommendations that really jumped out along these lines?
So I agree, they're all wonderful. Now is a great time to say that these are my opinions and not those of my employer necessarily. It's important. I think 2.3 about elevating cybersecurity to be a risk discussion so that it's not on necessarily a cyber problem. And then I think it was 2.8 that talks about expanding the look at the risk, and then toward the end of the report we talk about third-party risk. One of the key things I remember is during the 4 years I had the honor of working for Suzanne Spaulding, and she really is the brains behind what is now CISA. She talked about that vision the day she hired me. I think that as you pull all that together, one of the things she always taught us was think about the consequences. It's not just about what's going on in the network. Think about what this means for the actual events that are happening, and that's what ties it into critical infrastructure. So if something bad were to happen in cyber, and use bad in quotes to mean the whole spectrum, what does that mean? So in a corporation, is that a material event? Is that an event? In a federal agency, is that the ability or the lack of ability to provide 44 million Americans with food in the morning? And so I think that elevating that risk is important. In a CISO's type of seat, it's important at a CISO of an agency or of a corporation, because then it's not on just the cyber people. It's the risk that the entity is purposefully taking. If you decide you don't have the money for X, you understand that you accept the risk for Y. And so that's half the battle when you go upstairs and explain why you did it. If you didn't have a reason for what you did, the sitting duck phrase, I think, applies much more there. And I think the other piece to the funding point that Emily raised, the other big advantage of multi-year funding is that you get the advantage of thinking ahead. If we think about, I'll use those two letters, AI, right? What that really is a lot of compute power, a lot of expensive machines, and a lot of energy. The price for that is going to go up. The more we get addicted to that great compute, the higher those prices go. We have to give CISA and other agencies the ability to buy in and lock in good rates to that and other tools so they can establish these capabilities before they get out of their affordability range. And that's what the adversary doesn't expect us to be able to do. And I think that's why what Emily pointed out is so important, again, about the multi-year piece as well.
Yeah.
I just have one point here. To Phyllis's good point about raising the focus on cybersecurity within the executive branch agencies in the report and the idea of accountability. So, again, it's been several years since I served in government, but one thing I know is that when a CISO is identifying a significant risk, it can be really difficult to get the business to accept that risk. And if you look at the headlines, you can see CISOs, some of them getting convicted, some of them being investigated. There's real accountability. But where there's not accountability is in the C-suite beyond, right? Very little. And if you look at that change, and then look at in the government context, secretaries, departments, and agencies, how often are they brought up before a congressional committee and asked, why are you buying stuff? Why are you doing things that consistently find themselves, prey to our greatest adversaries, and to some extent by, non-state actors, criminal organizations? In some way, there doesn't seem to be any accountability for this, and I think CISA plays an important role of identifying that risk. And so, where's the follow-through? I mean, if Congress were focused a bit more on making sure departments and agencies were accountable for the problems that CISA helps identify, and instead of criticizing CISA, then I think we'd have a different security story. We'd be stronger. So I think this is just an important issue of why isn't the secretary of this department or that not being asked, what's your security scorecard look like? And if you're telling me the same thing every quarter, every 6 months, should you be in the job?
So, Ben, if I could jump in there too, I would love to do a follow-on project to this project that basically is a handbook for cybersecurity oversight for the Hill. And what happens is that every committee on the Hill is responsible for one or two or several government agencies, and they call in the heads of those agencies and they ask them a ton of questions about their functioning. Very rarely is the expertise resident on those committees to know how to ask the right questions about those cyber scorecards and what they mean, and what the trend lines mean over time. I think that one thing that CSIS could be is a way to think through, these are the questions that you should ask if you are members on those committees for all of these departments and agencies to hold the leadership accountable. Bringing down the CISO to testify is one thing, but bringing down the leadership and asking them the very direct question, that highlights that this is a priority for Congress.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because this is all about risk, and risk is all about choices. And Emily, you had mentioned the storytelling. I've always looked at my role as being a choice architect. How am I architecting choices for the business and the organization? Some that I get to make, some that somebody else gets to make. And let's also be real. We know we can't eliminate risk. Sometimes you're choosing between what's the least crappy choice. And really having your understanding and the data that supports that, or your logic and strategy that supports it. That, at the end of the day is I think what we need to do. And sometimes bad things are going to happen. It doesn't mean I'm not accountable, but I also think that when we make a risk decision and people say, I've accepted the business risk, they implicitly don't really understand they're also accepting the responsibility to react to it when it manifests. Because risk acceptance is a business process. It is not a control. And understanding those differences is important to how we architect the choices and what choices we eventually make.
Let me pull on this conversation for a second, because I think we're hitting through accountability at some of the discussions we had also as the task force about kind of public and private sector difference. So when you put on your choice architect hat in your role formally as a CISO, how does that conversation occur? Just give us an example. And how does that differ from the conversations we're used to kind of pre this key inflection point with CISA in government?
Yeah, for me, I'm a former finance guy, so for me, I've always architecting choices, just different choices of do I invest in this or not invest in that. So for me, it's just do I invest in a risk reduction now in prevention, or do I invest in detection and response? And it's tough though, But it gets back to what Emily's saying, understanding the story, understanding the potential material impact and exposure that could be created, and then along that path, recognizing the choice that I make today has a temporal effect of risk down the road, because the decision I make today affects the risk down the future. And we don't necessarily do enough future casting. And what I'll say, the ripple effects of unintended consequences, because we're so myopic. And I think businesses struggle with that. I think the government, federal civilian agencies struggle with it. There's a similarity, but at least on the business side, my structures are different, my bureaucracies are different, right? So I might have more wiggle room versus having to go, request funding from Congress, right? And then go into, again, that multi-year cycle. At least in the business context, unless the business has some dramatic shortfall in revenue, I know that I'm not going to have a steep decline in my spending. But there's been studies recently, particularly in the past 20 months, that cybersecurity spending has flattened and gone down even in the private sector because of the economic effects that we've been seeing the past 20 months.
So jumping in on that, so you mentioned the previous work that we had done on some of these issues. One of the most genius things that I saw from the private sector was a CISO who had personified the threat for their board. He had dubbed it a particular animal. I don't want to dime him out on a public stage, but he had found an animal that was going to be the threat that was out there, and he used that to communicate to the board that this thing was lurking in the shadows and was always coming to get us. And if we didn't, prepare and make ourselves resilient, then this animal was going to win. And it's basic, but it also speaks to a very human capability to absorb a story in a way that you can't necessarily wrap your head around. Here are some numbers, and here's the rising cost of cybersecurity. And you got to make it personal. On the flip side, on the government side, I just got back from a really fabulous trip to Albania and Montenegro, both of whom suffered very serious cyber attacks in the summer of 2022. And both are really working very hard to not only recover, but build back better and create that resiliency. But they were seeing effects that you never really would have thought would be real unless you sat down and did a tabletop exercise or did some kind of a war game to play it all out. Like, for example, in one of them, you could not pass a new law until it had been posted online for public comment for a certain amount of time. Well, if all the government websites are down, you can't post something online, so you can't post a new law, so you can't patch up your cybersecurity and do the things you need to do. It's a loop. And that, who would have thought that writing into law something about we have to be able to post this on a government website would, in essence, gut your country's ability to get work done? They're figuring it out. They're hugely grateful for support from NATO, from the US, from the EU. And I can see, they both are looking at Estonia as like, we have had our cyber attack now, and now we're going to build back better like Estonia did. But communicating stories like that to policymakers here in the US, we're not immune. And this kind of thing could happen to us as well. And we can learn from our NATO allies and their experiences and try to avoid the worst of the consequences they've already experienced.
No, that's a fantastic point. And there's also, what we forget too, is back to coordination. How do we coordinate all the different instruments of government we have that might be reaching out for, so if like the State Department through visitor programs and other mechanisms is trying to have expert exchanges, that it matches like teams from CISA or FBI or even cyber protection teams assigned to NATO to kind of work with these partners. All that is an inherent coordination challenge, and you can't coordinate it unless you can quantify the risk and then determine where to tell people to do something. Just to close out kind of some of the public and private sector similarities or difference, just from your perspective, Phyllis.
How are the public and private
Yeah.
different? How much time do we have?
As much as you want.
No, I think sort of in summary, as we look at sort of this context, and again, my own experience my personal opinions, in the private sector, we've come a long way as far as now it is the best thing you can do is to have lots of partners because we're all in this together. We have common adversaries to share the information, to learn the information, to share it internally, to share it externally with those partners, and to learn from our government partners that do see things that we won't. learn how to take that information and give the story back better. But part of that is the government, I think you raised this earlier as well, sharing government back with, information back with us, which is, I think that's getting better, but there's some work we can do to support there. To what Eric Goldstein was saying earlier, if you bring all that information together, which this moment allows, you have the people reporting information in, you have the regulatory information in, you will get a large piece of critical infrastructure. You'll see events that you've never seen before. And the collection of those, just like the weather map we had in NPPD, will be able to protect many others. I think there's work to do in the government in coordinating roles and responsibilities in cyber information. Even across civilian government, there's concern as CISA collects this information, what it would be used for. I think they've taken really good steps, as we did back in 15-16 as well, to make sure that there are guardrails. This is for cyber information only and not for other use by other civilian agencies. And then bringing in your partners, your law enforcement partners from across the federal government, your State Department, as was mentioned, everybody has a piece of cyber. But that common operating picture, if we can make it happen at CISA, we'll feed that, and then other people will add their piece to the story and have a much broader picture. And I would end that on, this is the piece that the adversaries cannot do. It's something that they don't want us to be able to do, and it's really up to us if we can get this right with, I think the recommendations on the report boost this. Do we take this moment, I think, and get it done? I think there's a lot of discussion of real-time information passing. That is a lot harder than it sounds, because we do have the machine speed, we do have the calculations, but that information would have to, like your body's immune system, the antibodies have to get there and understand the virus at the right place at the right time. That information has to come to the right place at the right time. So that's going to be discussions with the security hardware and software vendors. Are you ready to receive this information? And all of this needs to happen choreographed. Is a good dance, but I think if we can do it, again, this is a moment, and it's one that CISA really has for all of us.
How about you, David?
Yeah, so I just spent the last couple of years living in Belgium, in Brussels, and so I had a chance to practice and spend more time in Europe and have a much more granular sense for how some of these things vary, not just the governmental, but the private sector. And a couple observations. One is that we could have great cybersecurity for a company in the United States, and I'm not going to speak for U.S. government networks that might be operating as part of the civilian work that's happening overseas. But you know what? The focus in Europe, and I think increasingly in other regions, is not on security. It's much more on data privacy. And so, if you think about GDPR or the different sort of data protection frameworks, these take priority often more over security. It's difficult to run them both at the same time. Imagine running an insider threat program that's GDPR compliant, if you know what that's like, for an organization. So it's actually difficult to manage these things. So if you have a conversation with a cyber agency in France or in Belgium or in the UK about how they're sort of navigating this and harmonizing, it's not working too well. So I think there's chronic vulnerability probably both in the private sector and my guess is across government networks in Europe. And we're seeing more regionalism. So companies are now contending with what their global standards are going to be. China has begun enforcing its frameworks on the private sector. This is really hard stuff. So if you're a CISA or a CTO or an incident responder, in all likelihood, the most sophisticated companies are getting hit hard somewhere in Europe, somewhere in Asia, and their networks are not segmented. They're not separated. Zero trust is not a thing for most organizations. And if it is, it's probably not managed well. So I see chronic vulnerability. On the flip side, when I come back to the States and start looking at the news more carefully here, I can see that over and over again, government agencies are finding that they're subject to the same vulnerabilities, the same incidents with the same security stack. That's just confusing to me because we don't have the accountability. How can you keep buying the same things, using the same things, doing the same thing if it's not getting better, it's getting worse? So that's something that's interesting when companies ask, and I'll end with this. Well, if I have an incident, if I'm going to share this information with, pick your government agency, will it get stolen by the Russians or the Chinese or some ransomware group? And the answer is, we have no confidence that it won't. And so it makes that conversation about sharing even more difficult. And so I think there's lessons geographically and in terms of the behavior and accountability story here.
Well, and also, we have to be prepared for the moment when that data privacy may take hold in the U.S. as well. So again, if we can learn from our partners, our friends, even our adversaries, how to actually do this more delicate dance of coordination and share, I think we'll be better off. I want to turn to one of the things that, it was funny to hear Eric Goldstein say we can't have a panel without saying the magic A and the magic I word. But I wanted to, Emily, give you an opportunity to kind of reflect upon, are there certain emerging technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence and machine learning or others, that could help overcome some of these? Or are these just fundamental problems of governance, trust, and collaboration that require more human ingenuity?
Yes, and.
Okay.
So we are all looking forward to a future when AI can run all the hard stuff. It can do perfect cyber defense, and we can all go home and not worry about those Friday afternoon at 5 p.m. phone calls that say there's a breach in the network. That does not look like an imminent possibility. Just to, spoiler alert, it's not going to be a tomorrow thing. I do have hope that the great advances we're making in AI right now are going to lead to more agile cyber defense. On the other hand, it will also lead to more agile cyber offense, and we'll see the cat and mouse game keep playing itself out over the years. I think there's a lot to be determined on how that comes out net-net, but I have hope that this will, in fact, at least reduce the number of 5 o'clock on Friday phone calls that we get, because systems can respond more quickly in real time. The report also calls out quantum as something that is going to be a game changer in coming years. I did a report recently that looked at 7 critical technologies for winning the next war, and as we explored the quantum piece, we talked to a lot of quantum scientists, and they are the ones who are of course, the most cautious about making big promises on the quantum front. But a lot of them said, we've been saying that quantum is 5 to 10 years out for about the last 20 years. And this time, we really think that quantum is about 10 years out. So great. But what that means is that the holes, the vulnerabilities that we have right now in our systems is a great opportunity for our adversaries to take massive amounts of encrypted data and just sit on it. And when quantum decryption becomes a thing, they can go back, they can decrypt, and they can see what we were talking about 5 or 10 years ago. Some of that is going to be just historical interest. Some of that is going to still be highly relevant because the government does move sort of slowly through upgrades at times. And for example, a submarine enters in service and stays there for about 50 years. So some of it's going to still be highly relevant. So if I had to point to 2, I think AI in the much nearer term and probably with more chaos and uncertainty surrounding it. And then quantum as, I think, a near certainty in the medium to longer term that could be a real game changer, especially in the world of intelligence where I tend to reside.
What's your thoughts, Malcolm?
Yeah, I think back to when I left Intel in 2015 and I went to work for Cylance, arguably the first cybersecurity company utilizing artificial intelligence to create a strategic bend in the curve of risk and lower the cost of controls. And I think since that time, in the past 7, 8, 9 years, you've seen a lot of cybersecurity companies use artificial intelligence and machine learning, bake it into their products to deliver better risk results. I think we still have a long way to go to be able to do that and leverage, large language models, ChatGPT, all those type of things we've seen emerge the past, 15, 16 months, and make us more operationally effective. But to Emily's point, it's also one of the reasons why I joined HiddenLayer. Today, artificial intelligence is highly susceptible, it's highly vulnerable, it's highly exploitable because the traditional controls do not work to protect it. I know that, having come from a cybersecurity company that's machine learning module was attacked in 2019. And I did better than most in securing that, along with a bunch of folks. So we have to leverage it as something that has hope and opportunity to do things better, but we also have to do a better job of recognizing where the traditional controls, the traditional standards will not adequately protect it. And I'll tell you today, it's not adequately protected. All the public models that are out there on websites that people can go download, many of them are already poisoned. Some of them will actually deploy malicious code because in the gaps, in the gray space in the models, you can hide code that will bypass your existing endpoint and network detection capabilities.
So I think one key thing we're hearing here, though, is techno ex machina. This idea we have that all of a sudden technology will solve all our problems is definitely a myth in the short term, and no amount of generative AI can make up for that.
Well, I think it's one of those things that I've always had this view from the psychology of risk. Risk surrounds and envelops us. Without understanding it, we risk everything. Without capitalizing on it, we gain nothing. We have to run to these risky things in order to shape the path of risk, and if we don't, we're going to be susceptible to the risk path in front of us.
It is almost Halloween after all. We could just go, like, leap into the scariness here.
We can. I'll be, I usually am a bit of the technology pessimist, only because in every time I've ever used a new gadget, it turns out to be the people and the bureaucracy that matter as much as the piece of equipment. But where I am a little optimistic here, and we were talking about this before, is how do you bring the ability of generative AI to synthesize large volumes of scenario data to almost augment how you might threat hunt or red team? I mean, a lot of the original architecture of threat hunt was as much human ingenuity in teaching someone how to defend on a network, and hey, what about this? And having ability to quickly generate scenarios and work as a team as a way of bringing you close together, there I see a lot of potential.
That reduction in time to context will matter a lot because it will speed up our decision-making ability. And if it can directly point us towards where, again, we have that exposure, will reduce a lot of potential risk.
But it's interesting then, because if we think about where we're hearing of kind of, I still think we need to know more from CISA on CADs over time. And I'm extremely optimistic. But let's say it turns out that we do have an amazing set of statistics. We've got it anonymized. We've even got APIs that researchers or CISOs can pull that historic data from and run their own models. Why wouldn't we also have these incident stories that were loaded in to be able to almost generate where you could work with your team or you could work with your team and talk about, hey, how would we respond to this what if? And those, there's no, doing it before it happens is priceless. And even though it won't be the same, I mean, David, what are some of your thoughts on how we can use AI here?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think from a security perspective, companies, boards have been hearing for a while, how are we stacking up on the NIST framework each year? What is the story each quarter? Tell us about incidents. But what are we doing next? What does it mean to do a better job, particularly if folks are asking for more budget? So this, I think, is the answer. I think it's having the ability to say we're not just threat hunting, because that's just searching the internet or your networks for certain key terms and IOCs. But doing some more serious scenario-based stuff, it's essential because AI is already enabling attackers to break in faster than ever at a degree of speed and the ability to swarm with technology sets that enable teenagers to do things that it would take nation states to do. We see it all the time. So I think that this is essential for companies and for government agencies to be ready. I think the greater risk, though, when it comes to generative AI, it's not the first, it's not the last AI summer, is that it's that shiny new toy. So every organization is saying, let's try this. Let's try it now. The president of the organization, the CEO is already up there saying, we're doing this everywhere. And the CISOs and CTOs are saying, and the GCs, oh my God, I don't have more hair to pull out, right? Because everyone's dumping all their sensitive stuff in there. And for the national security folks, we all know that there's somebody sitting there on that API grabbing it all. So it's a huge problem. So it's taking that energy and excitement, first off, scaring the hell out of people a little bit so that they don't do that so much. But then figuring out what are the use cases that will really make us safer. And this is a great example of one.
Phyllis?
I would say not quite everybody's dumping everything out there. But I think it's important to take a step back and say AI has been done for 40 to 50 years. It's older than I am. But there's the part about math, just sheer math, and it comes back to compute cycles, what we can do with computers right now, which what scares me some, what Emily is saying is also, even before we get to quantum, we may actually have the compute speed for an adversary to decrypt what they're trying to steal now. And so it is a big problem that you point out. Other part is let's not get so hooked on the generative AI piece that we forget that we're using AI all the time. When Eric was talking about with the analytics and that large amount of data and finding a needle in a haystack and something we might not have known about, that's not all generative AI. That's actually math and transforms and equations that come out with, it's like pouring oil into vinegar. It'll gap in weird places and finding those gaps that we wouldn't have seen in a massive amount of data that we couldn't have processed without computing the way we know it today. Generative AI, to the great point, is we have to be careful. We don't want to not use it, but we want to understand it. We want to guide it. We want to remember that it is simply a probability of what will the next word be. That's all it is. It's not smart, it's fast. So while it provides a lot, and I played with it last week, tried to write something and have somebody guess if I wrote that or it wrote that for something very important. But we have to remember that it does a couple things that scare me right now. One is we have no idea who owns the intellectual property on this. So if somebody is creating something in your company off of this and it's a public large language model, who actually owns that in the end? I think that's something we have to figure out as a world. And two is, back to my cyber nerd hat for a minute, that thing can create 0 days because it sees so much code. It can actually understand in weird ways that we wouldn't put together in our brains right now what creates a piece of code that gets into the memory of something that's out there across all of our critical infrastructure. So the next, we hear about this, and in my world, there's a lot of this across big vendors that we all use, and you have that window between when you know about it and when there's a patch that you hope those that weren't smart enough to come up with a 0 day don't know about it so you can get it patched. AI will trump that. And so it makes our jobs harder to find those vulnerabilities where the adversaries out there using it right now to puncture networks of targeted interest to them. And I think that really goes back to risk. We have to remember, first of all, who's using this against us. At the same time, understand how we use it to innovate as good guys. But this is very much a war game. It's not man against machine. It's man against man with the machine.
One thing I'll just say, coming into incident response investigations, you try to get visibility, figure out how they're doing to protect confidentiality, availability when there's a ransomware story. No one's good at data integrity, right? Yeah. No one's good at it. And so when an auditor comes in and says, how do you know the financial data was not compromised? There's no financial integrity management type monitoring software in most organizations. Maybe they have it on the financial data. So you have to do this very strange crosswalk. Well, it looked like this before, it kind of looks like this now. That doesn't cut it for national security systems, and it shouldn't cut it for most organizations. So if you're dealing with AI models, chaining them together, building something big and exciting, and you want to be confident that when somebody gets in your environment, they don't change a 0 to a 1. I mean, we know what the consequences could be when you talk about weapon systems. Yeah. But when you're talking about, the energy grid, health systems, diagnostics in the healthcare context, figuring out what might be a cancer, what might not be. We have to get our act in order. This is another area where I think CISA can do a lot to help develop the integrity-related data monitoring. Yeah. And it's just not something that we see in the private sector. So I think in many ways we're not ready for this, and this gets me a lot of concern.
Yeah. I would agree on that. There is something underlying here about how we are going to relearn to trust in the 21st century. If it's that easy to poison data, which it is, right? And it actually requires less data to corrupt a data set than it does require data to make it. So the costs, in theory, to poison the set are lower than the cost it is to maintain it. I think it's going to have to be well beyond CISA, though, and get at a broader social discussion, and then, frankly, bring in ONCD, NIST. And a lot of this will be about this whole idea of how are we determining the kind of NIST certifications for test and evaluation of different types of models, and who are the different actors across the federal government. We have to go as far as like an FDA for some of these models that actually can publicly advertise and account for it. At the same time, how do we do it in a way that it doesn't overreach and stop innovation before it starts because some young entrepreneur or old one is unsure which way the government regulation is going to go and just moves on to something else. So I know I interrupted you. I'm sorry. I get fired up about this one because it's scary and exciting at the same time. It's like a roller coaster.
Yeah, no, I think you're both right. That data integrity element is critical. Not only the data integrity in the creation of the model, but the protection of the data integrity while the model is running live, real time. Because, again, David mentioned some of it. Pharmaceutical companies are using AI to figure out drug interactions to protect people. Again, what's the integrity of that? If you're using AI in the food safety context of a supply chain of food, and somebody can play with the integrity of that, people will get sick, right? You think of autonomous vehicles, the integrity of that data, right? So every place we deploy it, we have to think about the data integrity. The availability and the confidentiality are critical, but to David's point on the European side, data privacy, I love it, we have to do it. But in some cases, the integrity of the data is more critical than the privacy of the data.
Any thoughts, Emily?
So before Albania and Montenegro, we went to the UK and hung out with some of our colleagues in the Five Eyes and talked to them about their efforts. They are going all in on this concept of secure by design and are pushing their private partners to incorporate these ideas at the very beginning of all of their projects. And we attended a conference where some of those private sector colleagues stood up and talked about how they're thinking about things differently because the UK government is pushing this secure by design idea. It's nascent, but it's a good model, and I was encouraged to hear that they're having a lot of cross-Atlantic discussions about the same idea. So hopefully this is one of those ways where we and the Brits can link arms and step forward together and use these concepts with AI, with our data integrity, and then also in our government contracting.
Just think of how fascinating this is. If we were to do this conversation 10 years ago, would secure by design or thinking about data integrity have been so clearly obvious of what you would have to do to secure the future, of that we'd have to send diplomats, large diplomatic contingents to the International Technical Union and even negotiate device standards or other things that might allow us to be more secure. I asked that because there was a couple questions before we didn't get to for Eric and Suzanne, which was really about threat hunt. So if I could just ask you all to put on your future hat and go 10 years into the future, with me. Besides being a little plumper, bolder, and older, what would my world look like in terms of threat hunt? Where do you see this going?
To be honest, going back to what we just talked about, trust becomes the attack surface. Because if I trust it, I then shut off my brain to thinking about distrusting it and looking for things. And so that's what I worry about, and I think we have to think about the things that we trust the most are the things that we probably need to be afraid of the most.
Ouch. Emily?
So I'm an optimist, sort of by design, and I like to think that we stumble over some of these technological advancements and then we pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and we find ways to actually incorporate them properly. I would like to think that in the future we have AI to do complicated things like secure supply chains, to secure networks, to identify a threat in the sense that that activity looks odd to the AI systems, and they say that we're going to isolate that and we're going to segment off that part of the network automatically, and we're going to contain any of the issues quickly. So it becomes not worth it for the adversaries to go after certain networks. That's my dream. That's what I would love to see happen. I do think the trust piece is going to be really difficult. We had an event here a few months ago with a coalition of companies that the C2PA, which are trying to find ways to stamp images and stamp videos with a seal of authenticity, basically. This is what it appears to be. Conversely, right now we're seeing what's going on with Israel and Gaza and so much disinformation flowing all over the place, and it's very hard to tell what's real and what's not. And things become truth in the world before anybody has a moment to breathe and say, yes, this is truth. I look at the next generation and what are they going to be able to say, like, yes, that's real, no, that's not, and how can we create those structures of that honesty and that trust to create that future that we're all hopeful for. So I envision a world 10 years from now when we do have systems that can be a safety net for us, and that we've thought about the safety net to the safety net, so there's resilience in the networks, where threat hunt is something where the computers can take the first stab and then the humans can come in behind and clean up anything that needs to be cleaned up, and where we put a real premium as a society on integrity in both technical senses and in human senses.
So it looks like we are building quite the workforce for CISA if they're going to have to solve kind of the issues of fundamental breakdown of trust in society. Yeah. But on a narrower sense, I mean, good luck. I'll do it with you. But just to kind of narrow it back to that threat hunt picture, let's just really talk specifically about CISA threat hunting on actually federal networks. Like, what do you, both of you, imagine that looks like about 10 years from now?
I think it's going to depend on how much is centralized, if technically what it's going to look like. It's funny, I read an article in an IEEE magazine about a week ago about the sort of from the early days of the ARPANET all the way to where we are now and how the internet grew up with Vint Cerf and others. And there was not a mention of security. And it's interesting because it was about interconnect and bandwidth and people and the personalities and when things got built and universities as a backbone and no security. Because I had the opportunity when I was at DHS to ask one of these sort of fathers of the internet, where was that in this picture? And he said, we did think about it, we just didn't need it. And I think where we'll end up now is that we'll make better decisions, we'll do security by design, but in past experience in the federal government, every agency is different. And you have to give a CISO enough autonomy to create his or her own sense of risk for what's best for that agency to do their mission with the right balance of centralized services. So threat hunt, I'd like to think, and I think it does to some extent more and more every day happen with a variety of tools, but not every agency has a class 1 red team that can go in every day and understand exactly what's going on. So what will the acceptable balance be? It goes back to, as Malcolm has said many times, risk. But I do think CISA will be able to, or somebody will have a cadre of experts. I don't envision it's financially best necessarily to have a team in every single place, but a team of experts where you bring in the Ghostbusters and you do a regular threat hunt. But the threat will be different. The infrastructure will be different. As we move to cloud, some of that offloads onto other providers, which gets the report's mention of third-party risk. What are we expecting there? But I think it'll be much more regular, not regulated, but regular. It'll be expected, and it'll be part of the sort of hygiene. Right now, it's pristine. Not everybody does threat hunt, and red team, and adversarial emulation. But that will become part of what we do. It'll become designed in. I'll leave you with my favorite story of this is just we've all been sitting on an airplane for 3 hours. I'm not trying to figure out why we haven't left, and they tell you the sensor's on and we can't figure it out. But that's for your safety. That one little sensor, whether it's bad or it found something in that jet that is wrong, that's what we need our networks to do, to point that out for us.
David?
So, to add, I mean, this is a takeaway from the private sector experience, but it's equally relevant for CISA and federal networks and the .gov. So we are used to thinking about cybersecurity in terms of IT, normal networks, but operational technology and products are increasingly a part of the environment for everyone, including in the .gov. And when I step into an incident and ask, what's our visibility into the OT environment, the answer is often, do we have OT? And then I think it's zero. I'm sure it's zero. When it comes to things like diagnostic tools or devices with firmware, almost no visibility. So this is where the bad guys go. So I think having visibility into OT, and again, it may seem like, why would a federal agency have that? Well, try hacking a building, right? It isn't that hard. Elevators, when they go down, bad things happen to good people. So I think there's that's very basic stuff, but I think it's an important part of the mission set and where it's easy to sort of cause real trouble. And then I think the other piece is, and again, this is past as prologue, but third-party risk management has not been solved and AI has not solved it. So if you look at the supply chain to any federal agency in the private sector or even across the government, having visibility into that, the number of government contractors, including those who have clearances that I've seen that have massively been owned by nation states or by criminal groups and have no obligation to tell government agencies, and even if they do tell, it's not clear what happens. This is a huge problem, and we haven't solved it, but I do think that if we solve this problem in the future tense, but we don't have a sense for how we're going to make sure that the government contractors are responsible, and we see some good things happening, but I think we're a long way from it. And frankly, if they're not told, they're legally required to have that visibility, then they're not going to know, and they're not going to report it. So I think this goes hand in hand. The last thing I'll say is that this accountability story is central to it. If we don't hold government departments and agencies, secretaries accountable for the failures of their key government contractors and of other government agencies, then it's not going to change. So if they keep rewarding companies and government agencies for their bad cyber behavior, then we're not going to find ourselves stepping into an optimistic future.
I think what David said is correct, and I think it's hard because a lot of people look to the legal requirements, do I disclose or not disclose, rather than as an individual, as a CISO or somebody responsible, and say, I have an obligation to protect my customers regardless of the legal mandates that I may or may not have. I can tell you, I've disclosed many times that I didn't legally have to. Why? Because I saw my job as protecting my customers. And if I had something that went bump on my network that could affect my customer, I had the moral obligation to tell them regardless of whether or not I had a legal obligation, which again gets back to trust and accountability. And you have to look at those individuals, to what Emily said, and said, are those individuals going to go above and beyond a legal mandate? And if they are, you probably should be able to place more trust in them that they really have your best interest at heart.
So we've already been just, kind of answering questions online. And I think for folks in the audience, if you scan that, it should, in theory, pop up on my device unless someone is poisoning your question, which would be fantastic for an environment like this in some ways. But the other question that kind of came online that I wanted the panel, the task force members to address was about the joint collaborative environment. And really, it looks like the question's really about what does it really look like? And could you give an example case of what you would want to see this joint collaborative environment look like inside CISA and the types of information and services it would provide? I know it's a big question.
Well, I think, as we talked about in the task force and as we saw in the report, there's silos that exist.
Yeah.
And to some extent, those silos are there for good reason, so people have their organizational autonomy. But, the joint collaboration environment really has to be one where, again, people have that ability to cross the boundaries. CISA has the ability to pull information between them and then, tease out some interesting context that might be applicable to the people who shared it or to some other agency or to their, protection of the private sector, right? Because all of these things are independent but interdependent risk issues. And that joint collaborative environment needs to recognize that independence, but in essence, the interoperability of the threat vectors, getting back to the threat hunt question of how do you actually look between all those things and then, find the needle in the haystack that could affect multiple agencies and thus the mission.
Which goes back to your kind of weather map, right? The common operating picture is the core requirement to be able to pull this off.
If I were to use an example, and Eric raised earlier vulnerabilities in Cisco, and this happens across the world to all vendors. It's not about one company or another. But when one of these happens, just at a very high level, simplistically, you learn about it from a partner, from the news, from a press release. You have to, at that point, in a security position, see your attack surface. You have to, and this is what CISA didn't have before continuous diagnostics and mitigation, because by putting all those tools in the agencies, they're reporting back. It's not just to protect them, it's to give CISA data on what's happening on those networks. So you can now go across that network inventory and say, where is that hardware or software? And it goes from, we called it months to milliseconds when Suzanne and I were there, but it takes your detection and response time down to something that, to what Emily said, reduces the profit model for the adversary. You can now look across your network and say, where is that problem? Who owns each of those devices? Put your response plan in place and move out. And I think that's what is so important about the speed. That's part of what will be part, I'm fairly certain, I'm not there, but that'll be part of a joint collaboration environment, because in the end it's a bunch of data. But how are you presenting that data to agency CISOs, to the world? Is it a queryable backend by a common picture? So if you rent a car, the dashboard looks somewhat like whatever car you normally drive. You don't have to sit there and relearn how to drive, because there's a standard presentation to this thing. And I think we're going to start to develop, as a country and as a world, performance indicators that we look for. So I think at the highest level, you'd have your dashboards, maybe one from each agency and then one from across the FedCiv. And then you'd be able to look and see steady state, what's good, what's bad, do I have a low battery, et cetera. But then going deeper in an incident, your operators need to be able to query that data and ask it what they need to ask it and talk to partners around the government and around critical infrastructure that should also have authorized access to it. That would be a vision that I would think, I'm guessing, I'm not at CISA, but I think that would be part of it.
It's just common sense. If you have an incident and you're told, look, if something's bad is happening, let's do some hunting. What am I hunting for, right?
Yeah.
What IP addresses do I need? What are the indicators of compromise? So what we have to do in the private sector is often get that from the FBI after a series of phone calls where they're trying to get access to our systems or ask government agencies. It should be so much easier. For a government agency, they should be able to just go to the JCE or something broader and find that stuff without having to talk to anyone. It should be very simple. And the intelligence objection to this is ridiculous to me. If anything, the intelligence, and this is the sources and methods debate about sharing access to this information. So if you look out in the world, where is the cyber information needed to defend, right? You can buy it from the forensics firms. The insurance companies have some of it. Some of the big private equity firms have it where they're thinking about how to manage risk across. But for the federal agencies and the .gov not to have ready access to this is just ridiculous. It just basically means we're not just tying one but two hands behind our back because you can't threat hunt for something if you don't know what you're looking for, right? So this is a very common sense thing. And I think that on the flip side, right, because there are some objections that the intelligence community has raised, and having done as a lawyer for the intelligence community on the DoD side, maybe the story should be about making sure that our same capabilities to look at threats outside the United States are being directed at where the bad guys are in the United States, because it shouldn't just be the FBI. It should be our broader set of capabilities, monitoring our networks. Again, this is a hard issue, and I'm a lawyer, so I understand. But this is where we're getting hit. The bad guys, they know that if they're coming at us from overseas, we're going to see it much more clearly if they're coming from Texas. Yep. And so I think that this whole sort of narrative is upside down.
Well, and to your point, in getting back to the threat hunting and a 10-year view, if you can do that, because by and large we've been talking reactively, what indicators of compromise, how that type of stuff. With that data and organizing it across the various silos, you can start understanding the potential attack paths and attack depth that could occur.
Yeah.
And proactively, instead of just threat hunting, you start risk hunting. Where do I have exploitable attack paths that exist prior to the exploit happening? If you can start doing that and shifting threat hunting into risk hunting and really understanding attack paths proactively, we can also start strategically bending the curve of risk beyond just reacting to it.
No, but data is so key to this risk hunting,
Absolutely.
right? So when I'm imagining my own answer to this before I turn to Emily, I'm a researcher. And so I think sometimes we think, I just got to see my network, I have to respond now. But I would want to have time freed up where I could pull past patterns to look at those speculative futures. The best prediction, the first baseline prediction of the future is what happened in the past. And then we can augment different variables or parameters for where we think that might go. And if I have that pool, so not just a dashboard, but I actually have a set of data that I can manipulate, I can run statistical tests, I can apply different forecasting techniques, I think that would be the key to that risk hunt. Which, by the way, another plug for people, you can't just expect the machine to understand thousands of years of human philosophy and research.
Well, and to some extent, like you said, backwards, but think of how Google Maps works.
Yeah.
Right? I have a destination. We generally know where the bad guys want to go to affect us. But what we don't do is start from there and walk back out to any endpoint, any surface thing, and say, what are the paths that exist and what are the priority ones that are the easiest for the attacker to exploit?
Yeah.
We can do that.
Yeah. Emily?
I'm going to make a pitch, sort of counterculture here as the person who has never been a CISO and probably never will be a CISO. It has to be user-friendly. When people are turning to this thing, it's going to be in the midst of a crisis, and that is not the time to be like, I took a training like a year ago on which buttons I push to pull up which pieces. And the amount of data that we're talking about folding into the joint collaborative environment is fabulous, and it's a wealth of knowledge and wisdom. But if you can't get to it in 5 minutes in the middle of a crisis, then it's pretty useless. I would also make the pitch for whoever's building this sucker to think ahead to the storytelling piece of it. If you are the response team and you're attempting to figure out what threats are out there and you find something that's wrong and you're reacting in a crisis, the last thing in the world you want to do is have to take somebody offline for a few hours to interpret all of the stuff you just found for your board or for your secretary or for your undersecretary. You want those people doing the work. So instead, what you want is something that you can hit print, take it to the meeting and hand it out and have it make sense quickly. So, all the data in the world is fabulous, but if you can't explain it properly to the people who can make the decisions, then you might as well not have it.
Oh, I mean, this is something I'll give a shout out to Jose and Yasser from our team. Have been doing a lot of experiments with this. As one good rule for generative AI is to actually quickly condense and explain complex information and help you be able to pass that off. I'm worried not just about the human factors of the moment of crisis, but about, do you have the workforce, cyber workforce that now will also be a data science-driven workforce, which means we've just doubled the salary that we can't already pay them, that'll be able to do, like, constantly doing those kind of risk hunting procedures, which is a different function than we would think would normally exist in CISA. It almost becomes like a little research team that's in there constantly crunching data and forecasting. I have one final question that came in, and this would be a great one to end on, because it's another big one. We see a lot of intertwined relations and roles in regard to cybersecurity. But is it plausible to expect clearly defined roles for CISA and other agencies? What are the trade-offs and what are the obstacles?
Is it plausible to expect different roles for CISA and the other agencies?
In regard to cybersecurity.
All right, so yes. Yes. And not only is it plausible, I think it's essential. Mm-hmm. So I have bounced around the federal government in a lot of different positions. And the most frustrating moments are when something is nobody's job. And they're all going like this. Well, no, that's what we do here. That's what somebody else should do. That's not in our mandate. The second most frustrating moments are when it's multiple agencies' jobs and they all think that the other one is doing it better. So, it's our job, but it's only kind of our job. Having those conversations and very clear delineation of authority is the only way the federal government works really well. And I think CISA has been so successful in so many of the things that it's done and is trying to scale in a really important way. But in that scaling, what I don't want is for a whole bunch of the other agencies and departments to go, oh no, that's CISA's job. We don't have to actually do that. So having the very blunt conversation, probably led by ONCD and OMB, about these are your roles and responsibilities and you better stick to them is critically important. We're in football season right now. I'm a big football fan. And a football team only succeeds if every player on the field does their job. And this is one of those areas in the federal government where if we have vulnerabilities somewhere, we have vulnerabilities everywhere. So everybody's got to know their job. They've got to hit that route. They've got to throw that ball. They've got to catch it. There's got to be a blocker waiting for them. And I think that the idea that, well, we'll sort of figure it out is not the right approach.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Emily said. Structure drives behavior and you get what you measure. You don't want to play this game. I'll use a different story. Kindergartners playing soccer. You ever watched it? They all run, none of them hold their position and all that type of stuff. You don't want that to occur because when that happens, we will lose the game.
I think there's less nose picking in federal government.
So within the government, of course, I think that CISA can have these different roles, even if they're apparently conflicting, and I think it can do it even if it doesn't get more resources. I think one of the big challenges, though, is if that partnering and coordination really happens, if we don't get the common operating picture with the joint collaborative environment, it'll be difficult. And I think, just looking out, and again, this isn't the key focus of the report, but from the private sector perspective, this is really at risk, the role of CISA, because I think we're going to be seeing significant new regulations in incident reporting. And if you know that you have to report within 72 hours to a government agency about something you really don't know anything about, that's really uncomfortable. And if you don't know what's going to happen to that information, so I think that trust conversation is very different when you move beyond the contours of the federal government, but I think that there's greater hope in terms of that being able to have multiple roles and responsibilities within.
So for those that don't know, I'm a very big Georgia Tech football fan, so Saturday was tough. But a couple games ago against Miami, at the very end, they pulled it out. And I would say our federal government works very, very well in a cyber crisis. Everybody manages to pull it together. I think it's that layer just under crisis and then all the way to steady state where we pull back a little bit and people say, well, we'll figure that out, or that not my job, doesn't happen here. And that's where it needs some work. But I know that it can be done, and I get to have the optimism because I've seen it done in a crisis. I think where we need to oil the machine better and kind of get the team more working well together is what do we do day to day in that kind of response, and who's feeding whom, and how is it one government. And part of the problem has been some of the equities. If you release There's nothing more, first of all, I'd love to unplug the network that makes it secure. But secondly, if you were to release all the vulnerabilities and to the right places, you could get those healed. But then you would end up divulging other things that you don't want to divulge that hurts us in other ways. So what's the balance? And I think part of us working that together, and this has been a 20-year problem that I've seen at least, and probably more than that, is everybody being willing to do their part of it, and do their part of it even if they wish it were another part of it, or even if they're not in favor of that role, and that goes to the private sector too. So have some of that momentum, that team spirit that we have when there's 2 minutes on the clock, and get it together, and then make that your steady state. I think that there's some work to do in the government with the coordination. And especially as all this data is going to come in, there will be more conversations on how to use it, and certainly on the privacy and on the data integrity. And the bad guys are not having these conversations. They don't care about our privacy or theirs. They don't care about civil society. So the ability to move fast, again, this is a moment.
Yeah.
And if we can empower CISA to work with all those partners, one we didn't mention today was the NSA Cyber Collaboration Center, very private sector focused facing organization to pull some of that, as to Suzanne's point earlier, trying to declassify as much information as possible. We have all the parts together. We've made a lot of progress, but pull it together as if there are 2 minutes on the clock and operate like that always, and you won't always get down to that urgency.
It's all right. CISA is going to be as fast as Randy Moss. Burn down the sideline, get it up. Hey, we want to end there. I want to thank each member of the task force for your creativity, your insights, your professionalism, but most of all, which I think really is an underlying theme of this report, is service. Each one of you has spent time in your professional life trying to grapple with what is really the defining feature of the 21st century, that our lives are mediated by information networks for everything from how we deliver public goods, a big theme of here, but even how we build and sustain our relationships in our life. So it is an incumbent upon each of us to find ways to secure that and to protect the data integrity and to ensure that our federal government in the United States, and also as working with our partners and allies, can actually build a simple, easy-to-use solution that allows you to risk hunt, that allows you to actually coordinate with the private sector as well, and remove some of the worst instincts of the government bureaucrats, each pointing a different direction. And I'm actually a little more confident at the end of this than before I started. So definitely a thanks to Grayspace for giving us this opportunity. And I know you're going to continue doing a lot of work with that larger network you're building, with your other partners and clients like Booz, and even other folks at the state level, which is something we didn't talk about. One of the things we didn't really get to in this report, so if anyone's out there and wants to fund it, we would love to do it with you, is taking this now down to the next level for really the state and local government, because that is probably even more of a wicked problem than it is here. So each of you is now part of that dialogue, and I invite you to kind of take that active service with us. Thank you.